charity, by logic, necessarily excludes the idea of duty. When we think of charity, the average reasonable person would think that it is an act of good or a socially responsible act which you do out of your own free will, even when you didn't have to. So by that, it implies that you were not forced to do charity. And that is the basic stance that we want to take in this debate, and that charity is basically not a duty. And when you apply this to the motion at hand today, in the sense that the only social responsibility that corporations have is to make profit, we think that social responsibility is a form of charity. And we don't think that anyone, corporations or otherwise, should be forced to do charity in society. Now, we think that the problem in this case is that in recent trends, at least in the current century, is that there's been a trend of governments trying to force individuals and corporations to engage in charity and socially responsible work. What do I mean by this? You have governments trying to force companies like Shell, like Esso, BP, perhaps to support the eradication of HIV in Africa, or other socially responsible goals that they see as desirable, that these companies should do. And we object to this idea on three grounds, basically. We object to it philosophically in the sense that it is not the right allocation of labor in a liberal society, in the sense that that is not what the government is supposed to do, and that is not what the role of the corporation is supposed to do in a society. We object to this idea on economic grounds in the sense that it is probably the worst way to promote the social well-being of society, and this is where we'll analyze how, by focusing on profits, corporations can probably generate as much benefit to society anyway without doing any of these socially responsible goals that the government usually forces people to do. And thirdly, we also object to this on a social level, where Prad was going to talk about, in the sense that it really is probably the worst way of pulling people together in society to work in a harmonious way that you would want in a liberal society. And we think it shouldn't happen. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to just outline to you the philosophical objections that we have to this idea on how it's basically the wrong division of labor in a liberal society to force someone to do charity, and it's basically the government telling people that, I'm sorry, we're too lazy to do these things, so you might as well do it yourselves. And secondly, I'll also talk about how profits, by focusing on profits, corporations actually have the potential to generate more benefit to society as a whole, versus being forced to do these socially responsible activities. Yes, please, Tida. On.
Then corporations shouldn't be forced to pay tax to the government to build roads and build schools for people. Is that what your logic is?
That's a completely different case. When you get taxed, you're not actually being forced to build roads or to build schools. The government says that you have to pay a certain amount of money every year to live in a society for the functioning of society anyway, right? The government, or the corporation or individual is in this case not being forced to do anything at all. And it's the government's job to build schools and to build roads. And that is exactly what we're arguing all along, and that it's the government's job to do these kinds of things and not the corporation's kinds of job. And we're also going to tell you how when you do force corporations to do these kinds of jobs, they have a greater potential of, one, making less profits, and two, making a worse job of building roads and schools than the government would, just because they have different interests in mind anyway, just because one is the corporation and the other is the government. So let me get into this philosophical objection that we have on why it's basically not sound division of labor in a liberalized society to have the government sort of outsource these kinds of things to corporations. We think that in a proper society that wants to maximize individual liberty and wants to provide the welfare to people, there should be three things. One, the government should be the ones to be able to provide, whether it be the basic services that people need or maximize the liberty that people need in society. Because why? Firstly, it's why the government is there in the first place, right? If we want to talk about this in really old philosophical terms on why society came into being in the first place, that is why government was created, to build schools, to build roads, to do these socially responsible activities that we talk about every day. The idea that it was the corporation's job to do these things is completely alien. It only came up in this century. And let me tell you about how this idea probably came about. Pon is probably going to try to tell you that because corporations are so big, because they wield so much influence, because they have so much money, and because they affect so many spheres of life, and therefore it should justify them being more responsible to society because they're so rich. We say, first of all, we object to this completely. Just because someone has more money or has more wealth or a more degree of influence, there's absolutely no logical link on why somehow they should take the lion's share of providing schools or building roads. There's absolutely no logical link there. And we think that if you want to talk about in terms of degree of influence and power and wealth, we would say comparatively, the government has probably more degree of power, influence, and wealth than any corporation. And therefore, at the end of the day, whenever you compare, if you want to use the standard of influence, money, and wealth as a standard for determining whether someone should act or not, the government at the end of the day will always be the one that should bear the lion's share because it has wields so much influence. I'll take the last one, yes.
What about countries and corporations are basically owning the country in that case? Do you think the corporation should become the government?
I don't think there is any country ever that corporations ever own. But let's talk about those situations where the corporation has a very big influence, whether because it invests a lot of money in there or because it's really friendly with the government. We firstly say that therefore, in those cases, the cases that you're worried about in the sense that the corporation doing things that are harming society, those are things that are illegal anyway, right? These are things that are against the law, and these are things that corporations shouldn't be doing. And at any rate, in those situations, corporations are not forced to do anything positive. They're only prohibited to do certain things. So even though you want to talk about in those cases where they may have an undue influence in the country, we don't think it really matters at the end of the day. But what about this economic objection that we have on the role of profits, right? We think that if the goal of social responsibility is to help corporations do something good in society, we think that profits do that just fine. Letting corporations focus on profits is probably the best form of social responsibility that they can have. Why? Basically because when corporations focus on generating profits, they're not just generating money, they're generating the size of their companies as well. And when companies expand, of course they will need to hire more workers. And you can run your typical economic argument here on your adjudication sheet. In the sense that you produce more output, you hire more workers, there's more money to go around, and in general, society basically has more wealth. And allowing corporations to focus on this, we think, generates more wealth overall for society and therefore benefits society overall. We think the harm comes when you start forcing companies who are used to one line of work to do other lines of work. Esso is used to mining, pumping oil, distributing it around the world. It's not used to helping eradicate HIV in Africa. But these ideas of social responsibility do mandate that companies who are in one sector have to do some socially responsible act in some other sector. And we think that's not really useful because one, they don't have the expertise to do so. So there's a higher likelihood that whatever they do in that sector isn't going to be as effective as someone who would have expertise in that area. And secondly, we think that if they focus on another area versus making profits, they won't be able to generate as much wealth as they should. And that's basically why we're probably opposed. Thank you.